Welcome to Polaris Live. This is your host, Sarwar Kashmeri, with conversations on the US-China relationship and its global impact, as seen through the eyes of experts from around the world. This viewer-supported channel is brought to you in conjunction with the Foreign Policy Association in New York. My guest today is Mr. Peter Cloutier, a U.S. Foreign Service diplomat with significant experience in developing countries, including Afghanistan, Mozambique, Angola, and Timor-Leste. He serves as a research professor at the U.S. military's Joint Special Operations University in Tampa, Florida, and is a best-selling Amazon novelist. He appears on Polaris Live in a personal capacity. Welcome to Polaris Live, Mr. Cloutier.
Thank you, Sarwar, for having me. It's an honor.
Listen, since 1991, every year, China's foreign minister's first overseas trip is to Africa. But the United States seems absent in winning the hearts and minds of Africa's mushrooming population and middle-class consumers. You agree?
I do agree. I agree for the following reasons. I think we compartmentalize the geographic region and we prioritize too much. And so right now it feels like the pendulum has swung further east than Africa, and so the focus has been on the Indo-Pacific region. The conflict situation in the Ukraine and now in Israel and in the Palestinian region, those flare-ups, grab the media attention naturally. Taiwan certainly now is on the back of people's minds, and I think that's the reason why you're seeing that pendulum shift to the east.
Well, that's interesting what you say, but the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, Peter, says that in another decade, Nigeria alone in Africa will have a bigger consumer class than the United States will. And China has been involved in, 3 decades in Africa? So I want to ask you, there's a popular African quote that has it that when you Americans come to Africa, we get a lecture. When China comes here, we get a bridge. And you've spent so much time there. That's correct, isn't it? I mean, it's a half humorous quote, but I believe it's right. What do you think?
I believe it's right too. And I've mentioned this from time to time, and I think when you and I have spoken in the past, you and I talked about it. I mean, I think it begins with this widening gap between the American perception of what's going on the continent versus what is actually going on, which is an intellectual closing of the gap. So I think we stick to mindsets that may derive all the way from the 90s in terms of thinking about Ethiopia and Band-Aid and things of that nature. When today in this decade, the people with whom we are working day to day, for technical officers that are on the ground working in different social sector programs and reform, that intellectual gap is hardly even noticeable. And so I think, and I think back to conversations I've had on this front, we're still treating the relationship as if it were doctor-patient. And so that can be, I think, an infuriating feeling for counterparts when what they really want is peer-to-peer sharing of wisdom and being able to say, Peter, or whoever it may be from the U.S. government, this is a problem that we have. These are the solutions that we are proposing. How have you all addressed a problem like this? How do you all think of our solution sets? And so, meanwhile, our administrations, this goes all the way back to 9/11 almost. We use the word transformational. We use the word self-reliance. We use the word localization now. That's good. But when the practice isn't demonstrating the rhetoric, you've got a problem. And so, I mean, I think that's my first thought. I've got more, but let me stop there.
But let me ask you, Peter. What you've said is quite instructive, and I wonder it's because America is in this mood of saying, well, we want to make it safer for Europeans and give them a hand in military projects before we get to the bridge building kind of stuff. Do you think American strategy is a little bit skewed in that way?
I do. Now, I do think it's skewed, particularly when we're talking about strategic competition or strategic deterrence. And I know they intermingle, so I'll use both of the terms concurrently. You know, I'll use a popular Japanese proverb: strategy without action is a daydream. Action without strategy is a nightmare. I think that what happens when we are viewing what the People's Republic of China is doing with the Belt and Road Initiative, I think we miss it at the strategic level. That is ultimately economic statecraft. And I think our bias historically, in fact, I heard this on one of your programs. It was former Assistant Secretary of Defense Chaz Freeman. He was talking about, you know, first of all, I love the way that he rephrased global South as global majority. I think that's the way we need to see it. The other thing he said is that we have this historical mindset that the end is a military one. And I think we get that wrong with how Beijing sees it. And so as we posture ourselves, we can't figure out a whole of government, much less a whole of society, counter to what the Belt and Road Initiative brings to the table. And I think Beijing sees this as business deals. They see it as a business operation. And so they are able to give clear, black and white, win-win solutions, where from the US government side, we have a long list of all the potential support, and we can't even capture what the private sector and the NGO community is doing. And it becomes, I think, hard to balance a pragmatic response.
Well, you know, Peter, this just struck me as you were speaking, excuse me, that 30 years ago, China with Mao Zedong was very much a communist country, you know, in the traditional mold. And the United States was a capitalist business, you know, growth requires business. That was our mantra. And here in 30 years, China's become, you know, has 80% of its economy, as I read in a Harvard report, is free market. And America has seemed to gone backwards, which I know we've not. And a lot of people are grappling with it. And it's a difficult question. I'm just throwing this out to see if you can help us understand it. And I know it's not easy. So let's take a couple of minutes and see what you say.
Right. I'm sorry. Could you repeat the question, please?
Right. I mean, how is it that 30 years from the time that China was a full communist, you know, state-controlled economy, America has always been a capitalist, to now where 80% of China's economy is free market, right? They've learned to use strategic help, as in Africa, you know, around the world, and we seem to have gone backwards. Is that true, or is that just my impression?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, you know, in Harvard Business School, and for those that follow that subject matter, you know, you should know in the early elementary classes that there's a first finder's advantage, right? So the innovator is going to get the first crack at whatever comparative advantage or innovation is taking place. But followers also have an advantage because they can watch what's been done, find the vulnerabilities, and then tackle the vulnerabilities, and then one up what the first finder innovated. And that's oftentimes called innovator's dilemma as well, a term generated from Harvard itself. So I think that when you compare what what people can call two Cold Wars now. It was a whole of society approach in the first Cold War against the USSR that I think was definitely part of the equation that helped us achieve those winning objectives. And then, like you said, here we are now in a second Cold War where we're actually getting out-dueled in who can actually offer a more whole of society package. And so I think we're finding ourselves in some innovator's dilemma, to be honest. I mean, we're having a hard time breaking out of the mold of very siloed and disaggregated and empowered democratic principles that make it hard to unify then at the end, especially when you're talking about foreign policy. So you're not, it's difficult. Like I said, you got a whole sheet full of things that we're doing, but then, okay, well, give me the elevator pitch to that though. And you almost need an ambassador to be able to do that, her or himself.
Well, you know, you and I, especially you, I know, mix with the military, you know, a lot, and talk and listen and give speeches and so on. It must be a little bit frustrating because most of the officers that I meet are younger people, and it must be frustrating to them to see what is a natural strength of America not being utilized. Can you talk at all about that? I mean, do you find the same thing?
Forgive me, just can you ask?
You find that in the military, the younger officers, right, frustrated that America's natural strength used to be winning hearts and minds, and now it's not, or doesn't seem to be. Are they a little frustrated at this, and that we should be leading more in that regard?
I believe so. I believe so, and you know, special operations in particular has a focus on winning hearts and minds. And I think in the counterterrorism era, which that hasn't gone, by the way, but in that period after 9/11, in that focus on violent extremist organizations, it required a lot of buildup. I mean, we're just coming off of the Super Bowl, right? I mean, you don't score a touchdown immediately. You got to drive down the field. And so winning hearts and minds was part of that pursuit, sort of in the early stages of that touchdown drive, because you've got to rely on counterparts in the host country who are also seeking those outcomes, right? To share information. I mean, there you get back to the peer-oriented platforms, and that when you build the relationships and trust, you then share the information. You're then able to pursue mutual objectives, and really, whoever catches the ball or runs the ball across the goal line, hopefully that doesn't matter as much as long as you get the touchdown. And I think we need to do a better job of triangulating that in strategic competition. With leadership in Beijing that I think has been very difficult to keep up with. And I think we underestimate how sophisticated their strategy has been.
You know, I'm going to tangent a little bit, Peter, to this Belt and Road Initiative that China unleashed now some 10 years ago, where, you know, they've put almost $1 trillion into building infrastructure in African, Asian, over 130 countries, much of it aimed at making the people there add to their standard of living. Now, you've mentioned to me in our conversations that the BRI, as it's called, has outcompeted traditional Western aid and finance packages by being more responsive, less conditional, and creating the image that they're not intervening. And I'm interested in your just putting that in plainer English so that our viewers can really understand.
Sure. My strong position on this is to actually compare our U.S. government Millennium Challenge Corporation versus the BRI, or the Belt and Road Initiative. Again, going to that sort of first finder's advantage versus that follower's advantage.
Yes.
The Millennium Challenge Corporation set up, you know, at the turn of the millennium, or a few years after, but in a time when the world was more unipolar. and at the time when counterterrorism was sort of the global agenda. But that put forth infrastructure projects, massive infrastructure projects, $500 million, which at the time seemed enormous. But there was conditionality to it that we, as the U.S. government, really wanted to see almost past the value of the infrastructure itself. That's transparency. That's accountability. And so what the Belt and Road Initiative, I think, wisely did was come in as a competitor and say, yeah, but we're reducing the competitiveness. This isn't different African countries vying for who's the most transparent, who's the most social sector, compliant or efficient. So they cut out competitiveness. They cut out the conditionality, and in particularly, they cut out the control of corruption part. They then turn, I think, what was and I'm not talking about the practice of it, but at least the strategy of the Millennium Challenge Corporation. They took out all of the progressive self-reliance pieces to it, and then said, "Hey, look, we're treating this as a business deal." So, and it made so much more sense. It was more practical, and then you didn't have to worry about the conditionality. And so, and I think that's where I don't think anyone is turning down Millennium Challenge Corporation big grants,
right?
But I think it is just, I think for sure in places it has put us more in a passenger seat to the Belt and Road Initiative.
Peter, let me interrupt our conversation by reminding our viewers that Polaris Live is a non-commercial, viewer-supported channel. So please help us grow by subscribing to our YouTube channel and adding your name to our mailing list at kashmeri.com. There's no cost, and it will really help us grow and maintain the quality that you've learned to expect from Polaris Live. And now back to our guest, Mr. Peter Cloutier. And Peter, I want in the second half of this program to, if we can, take a very constructive, positive approach, right? And you reminded me that during the Cold War between the US and the Soviet Union, when God knows that we were eyeball to eyeball in competition, the US and the USSR collaborated in a number of projects, including fighting smallpox, successfully, I might add. And so I'd be very interested in exploring in Africa and Asia what the US might do collaboratively with China to help improve the US-China relationship. Can you start us off with that conversation?
Absolutely. I just recently had a conversation with a public health colleague who was formerly with the Department of Defense on this very subject. And I have a quote from I have a quote about what the USSR and the USA did during the Cold War period about smallpox. So here's the quote. So according to global health scholar Dr. Peter Hotez, the USSR provided 400 million doses of vaccine to support global smallpox eradication campaigns in developing countries, while the U.S. provided key financial support. The World Health Organization, WHO, had previously underfunded inoculation efforts since the effort was considered a logistical nightmare. So the two nominally adverse superpowers joined forces to spearhead inoculation efforts. And here's the punchline. By 1980, the world was free of smallpox.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
Right. So, you think of polio. So, this is sort of the wild polio virus is still running rampant in small places, but we cannot get rid of it. It suffers from the same problem of these logistical nightmares, right? In places like Afghanistan, places like Pakistan, in rural, difficult to reach settings, as well as Mozambique. So, is this not an opportunity to say, like we actually had a chance to do in COVID, but didn't? Is this an opportunity to say, why don't we partner together and see if why don't we take a part two to the smallpox success and see if we can eradicate this? And I think what that does is it forces them and forces us to then put our values, our ethics, our integrity in full view and say, the common good, we are intertwined, our interests are intertwined with that, and therefore partnering makes sense. Let's do this.
Well, Peter, what really interested me in this when you and I first talked about this in that bus heading down the road at West Point was, if you believe what experts are saying, that the so-called global South countries, India, Brazil, and South Africa, and so on, are changing the way the world thinks of itself as a world order. The old established order, thanks to American leadership and all the institutions we set up in European, is changing. And these global South countries are increasingly becoming more influential. And what I really liked about your suggestion was that if we can think of projects like this, not only would we involve China and America, who have the most resources, but we can naturally connect into these projects India and Brazil, and so make it into a much more global. And as we head into this new world order, quote unquote, that we might then become so much more effective. Does that make sense?
It absolutely does, and I can give you a great example. I mean, when I was in Mozambique, I was the health office director there, and I got a call randomly from the Indian embassy saying that they wanted to talk about health partnership. And India being a manufacturer of so many pharmaceuticals, that was their end. So they said, "Here's our idea. What if we could actually sort of enter into this support or assistance or aid realm?"
This is, sorry to interrupt, but this is when you were working more on the diplomatic aid side?
Correct. So this was in Mozambique in the latter half of the last decade. And so the thought was, we could come in with, and it's funny, they were thinking of it in terms of weight of pharmaceuticals. And that was interesting because I think for us, we don't think of it that way. I'm not sure the Mozambicans did either. So it took some time to figure it out. I guess number one, that just tells you that simple equations can be difficult to understand because the perspective is different, right? So I mean, you can say the right things, but it doesn't matter what you say. It matters what's heard. So anyway, it ended up working out great. And again, my point is here is a stakeholder that has historically not been considered as an entity in that health sector realm in the global South. And here they are coming in and meeting with the minister and providing a value proposition that we know our stuff when it comes to pharmaceuticals. And so I'm not sure where that went afterwards, but I know that they engaged, I think, in at least a couple of years that I was there.
And I know that India was quite involved in making COVID vaccines at reasonable costs. So there are instances where this can really be made to work. And correct me if I'm wrong, but the epidemic in Africa a few years ago, the United States Army flew in a helicopter, right? In a week or so, we had almost 3,000 medical personnel on the ground treating people. So isn't that a natural strength that America has that we can share that China does not? But they have other strengths with their presence in Africa and so on. So again, I'm simply underlining the fact that what you are suggesting has some inbuilt strength, doesn't it?
It does. And, I think back to the Mozambique experience in 2019 when Cyclone Idai hit the coast of Sofala and primarily the capital of Sofala, Beira. Myself and a couple of subject matter experts that had flown in from CDC, that were disaster management experts. I mean, we were the first external civilians, not part of the UN disaster response enterprise that were there, flown in on a DoD plane. And so, I think that resembled all sorts of things, to be honest, with the host country government. One was that was a display of civ mil collaboration and efficiency almost more than anything, right? And then the second thing was, I think the intervention. I think that Beijing's non-interventionalist mindset and rhetoric about what the West is doing, it's a two-edged sword. But that was a demonstration of the positive side, right? So the things that I was engaged in when I was in Sofala at that time were things like leveraging logistics and supply chain functionality in an emergency situation when a lot of the government systems were shut down. And also helping to manage federal and state disagreements on power, and helping to negotiate and communicate with groups like Médecins Sans Frontières, who have, bang on the table and saying, hey, we've got a cholera problem, people.
Right.
And so, I'm helping to facilitate that without genuinely intervening and say, that's right, thou must do this in this situation. But I see, when things finally settle down, and it took a while for things to settle down, but there was a reflection that you all really helped us. We appreciated that. And so then you get back to the relationships and trust.
And so a question on the communications pipeline that you were just talking about. So when I came to America, I got a lot of help. I came from Bombay, India, now Mumbai, but I got a lot of help from the United States Information Service branch that was very close to my college. I mean, they helped me select a university. They helped me guide, do the tests that one needs to do to get in. And then in this economy move, the U.S. eliminated the U.S. Information Service. So with your experience, what I wanted to ask you is there a need, you think, for a more powerful communications outreach channel going forward, Peter?
Absolutely. And let me tell you why. I'll give you another example that I witnessed on the African continent. I'm going to go back to this sort of strategic competition, strategic deterrence mindset that we currently have in Washington. And we think about Belt and Road, the Belt and Road infrastructure plan, and we think about debt trap diplomacy is often the label we affix to it. And yet, in my time in Africa, I can remember when a bridge went up over a very important waterway that connected a country to one of the BRICS countries, right? And so it was hard to believe that this bridge hadn't been constructed before. But it was a Belt and Road project with zero signs or anything, because just the word of mouth that this was being done.
Wow.
Economic impact it was going to have with the country that had a natural port when the only other port in the area was all the way down in Durban, was, in contrast to, now I'm speaking for Western donors at large when I say the following, a big sign of a former president, beloved president, who's talking about natural resource conservation. I mean, can it get more benign than that, right?
Yes.
And underneath it was what seemed to be 20 or more donors and NGOs that all had their brands underneath it. You have to think that for a progressive Mozambican, perhaps the first thing that may come to their mind is, hey, that's former president, da, 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 da. And then, but whose agenda is that?
Right.
Is he being sponsored to do this because of what the external interest is, or is this sort of our own homegrown thing? And I think that when you get going back to the question that you asked, I think of USIP, for example, and Voice of America and platforms such as that, which perhaps have lost market share with how much now is available in the internet and social media and the like. But that was an opportunity to have an independent voice state facts. Facts are hard to come by these days, but so yeah, I do think that we suffer from that, and I know a lot of the conversations we've had within donor circles has been how hard it is to get, a consensus around a set of messages to communicate to the partner government. So, yeah.
Well, listen, Peter, we have, believe it or not, run out of time. And you mentioned that getting facts is very difficult, but that's the reason that we at Polaris Live like to have people like you who come in with facts, because they've got hands on the ground experience, feet on the ground experience in the so-called developing the world. So thank you so much for sharing your experience with us and ending on a positive note and giving us a number of ideas on how China and America can work together in the newly emerging world. So thank you.
Thank you, Sarwar. Like I said, I greatly appreciate the opportunity. It's always a pleasure to talk with you.
Well, and I want to thank our viewers from around the world. Please join us again on Polaris Live as we continue to explore the most consequential relationship in the world, that between United States and China and its impact on the world. Until then, goodbye.